So, Pokémon. I originally had a more proper introduction written for this video, but I realized this series doesn't really need one. Everyone knows what Pokémon is. It's one of the largest media franchises in the world, it's a long-running TV show, it's 20 plus movies, it's a trading card game, / pyramid scheme. There's all kinds of mangas and toys, and before any of that, it's a series of video games, and as far back as I can remember, I have always been a massive fan. I've played through almost every single entry in the main series. Pokémon Heroes and Lucario and the Mystery of Mew used to be two of my favorite movies. After YouTube, Bulbapedia might be my most used website throughout my life. When I was in elementary school, I wrote a couple of dozen pages of an embarrassing, cringy fan comic where I had it cross over with Ninjago, another property I was obsessed with when I was younger. I'd show it here, but unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, I'm pretty sure this is lost literature today. Sure, the games are very formulaic, and the gameplay is rather simple. They're clearly made with children and very casual gamers in mind, but I used to be the former and am currently the latter, so that works out for me just fine. Recently, now that I'm older and wiser, or at least I'd like to think I am, I decided I wanted to take a look back at the games through a more critical eye, and see which ones truly hold up under scrutiny, if any. I hope to get to all of the games eventually, but something had to be first, so where better place to start than at the very beginning, with the original games from 1998, Pokémon Red and Blue. Okay, if you want to get pedantic about it, the very beginning would be the Japanese versions of the original games, Pocket Monsters Red, Green, and Blue from 1996, which do actually have a few slight differences from the American versions aside from language and version-exclusive Pokémon, but I'm not that much of a completionist. Besides, assuming I actually do get to covering the rest of the series, I'm going to be playing through the Kanto region more than enough times. So, after revisiting it, what do I actually think of Pokémon Red and Blue? Well, as of me writing and recording this, I haven't decided on a title or a thumbnail, so I don't know if they're going to be a giveaway, but my overall thesis is that these original games, by and large, really don't hold up. I'm quite far from what you'd call a Gen 1er, and I don't think that things like age or historical importance puts media above scrutiny. They're not entirely without merit, and I'll give credit where it's due, but the slant of this video is going to come across as mostly negative. Ironically enough, the first point I have to make is actually quite positive. One thing I very much appreciate about the older Pokémon games in general is that it does not take very long at all for the player to be given free reign. After you name the hero and rival, have Oak lead you to his lab to choose your starter, battle the rival, go to Viridian City to collect Oak's package, deliver it to him, and get the Pokédex, which in total takes around 5 minutes, the game kind of just lets you play. You don't even have to watch the catching tutorial if you don't want to. In a lot of the later entries in the series, even ones that I remember otherwise really liking, like Black 2 and White 2, I could do without there being a cutscene every 5 steps for the first hour plus of the game. As we leave the tutorial area and get into the first dungeon, Viridian Forest, I should specify, the Pokémon games, the older ones especially, give the player a lot of freedom to play by whatever restrictions and or freedoms they want to. It's why there are 100 different challenge run rule sets people have come up with for the series. This obviously isn't a challenge run, but I usually still choose to play by a few self-imposed rules, which is obviously going to affect my experience, and therefore my criticisms with the game. So for clarity's sake, I play on set mode, meaning I don't get free switches after I defeat an opposing trainer's Pokémon. I don't like to overlevel. I never use items from the bag during battle, except for Pokeballs when I'm trying to catch wild Pokémon. I always like to use a core team of 6 that I build up throughout the main adventure, and I never use legendary Pokémon. Also, if you hadn't noticed already, out of the 2 versions I elected to play Pokémon Blue, mainly because I prefer the version exclusives in this game, and actually wound up using several of them on my team. I picked Squirtle as my starter, in part because it seemed like they would be the one with the most opportunity to shine in this game, and in part because I'm pretty sure it's the one I've chosen the least in the past. Bulbasaur may be my personal favorite of the 3, but it doesn't appear to get any of its best moves yet in Gen 1, and Charmander, I'm not one of those people that hates this evolutionary line just for being popular, but fire types as a whole really don't get much opportunity to do anything in Kanto, even less so in Gen 1 in particular. With all of that out of the way, let's get into the core of the game. The battle system in Generation 1 is extremely simple. There are no abilities, no held items, no weather, no entry hazards, no transformations, just moves, stats, and types. There are a few things that complicate it a little, however, most of these are bugs. The fact that moves that are meant to be 100% accurate are actually 99.6% accurate, the fact that neither the enemy AI nor the text that informs you if a move was super effective or not know how to work properly when confronted with a Pokemon that has two types. One of the only Gen 1 battle system quirks that actually seems to have been intentional was Special being a singular stat that functions as both special attack and special defense. So in these games, Special is just objectively the best stat that a Pokemon can be high in. That's a pretty significant balancing issue, I would say, and it's far from the only one of those that exists in Red and Blue. I mean, just look at the Psychic type on the Gen 1 type chart. And there are a lot more of these Gen 1 oddities that can happen while battling, but there'll be better opportunities to talk about the other big ones later. I don't want to drag on too long about them now, because it does take a while for any of it to become relevant. Battles in the early game aren't exactly very exciting. At this point, most Pokemon only know 1 or 2 damage-dealing moves, which often aren't even of their own type. They're usually just normal-type moves. All the player can really do right now is spam Tackle and hope that their Tackle does more damage than the opponent's Tackle. Ideally, the battles would get more interesting as you get further into the game, and you and your opponent start having a wider variety of Pokemon and moves at your disposal. In Red and Blue, however, I guess this is somewhat the case, but not nearly to the degree I feel it should be. Once your Pokemon knows a move of its own type, in most cases you've pretty much seen what battles with them are going to look like throughout the entire rest of the game. Most of the move pools are really shallow in Gen 1. In fact, there are a number of Pokemon that never even get as far as learning any moves that aren't normal type. There are a select few that learn a bit of coverage they can use, mainly normal, water, dragon, and poison types, oddly enough. But most Pokemon, even by the end of the game, are just going to know moves that do pretty much exactly the same things as the moves they knew in the early game, except with a higher base power. Plus, in Red and Blue in particular, most Pokemon used by NPC trainers don't even use custom movesets, they just know the last 4 moves learned by level up, which, more often than not, is a bunch of crap. It makes the game's difficulty curve feel a little bit stagnant. With a few exceptions, battles in the late game don't really feel much different from battles in the early game. In fact, if anything, for the most part, the battles actually got easier the further into the game I went, because by then I had a full team and could easily hit most any opposing Pokemon for super effective damage, instead of having to win the Tackle v Tackle lottery. I can see why they added those additional mechanics in the later generations. This battle system really could have done with some spicing up. After making it through Viridian Forest, we arrive in Pewter City, and can take on the first gym leader, Brock. Gym leaders are a staple in the Pokemon series. In most of the mainline games, one of your primary objectives is to defeat 8 of them throughout your adventure. Aside from awarding the player with badges that eventually allow them to take on the Pokemon League, which is usually the player's end goal, beating them is also usually what opens up new areas, and they are intended to stand out as especially tough compared to the other trainers you face. For me, however, Brock was probably the easiest trainer in the entire game so far. I beat him in 4 turns. Neither of his Pokemon even got a chance to attack. The random junior trainer in his gym gave me more trouble than that. And this trend continued throughout most of the game. For all the hype they get, having their own fancy facility, often having a themed puzzle leading up to them, being among the few trainers to have unique sprites, and in Gen 1, names, by and large, the gym leaders of the Kanto region were kind of total jokes. Gym leaders, as a rule, almost always specialize in Pokemon of one particular type, which in Gen 1 I don't think worked very well. There are a few exceptions, but through similar stat distributions, Gen 1's very shallow move pools, and the fact that dual types are actually quite rare in Kanto, and most that do exist are restricted to a select few type combinations, nearly every Pokemon of a particular type does pretty much the exact same thing, and thus has the exact same easily exploitable weakness. The rudimentary AI of the Gen 1 games does them no favors either. Most AI trainers in Generation 1 have modifiers, which, in theory, should make them smarter about choosing which move they'll have their Pokemon use, rather than selecting a move at complete random like wild Pokemon or trainers with no intelligence do. One of these modifiers, which most of the gym leaders use, prioritizes any move of a type that is super effective on the Pokemon the player has out, while deprioritizing any moves of a type that isn't very effective. The thing is, though, in most scenarios, this modifier only looks at the move's type, without taking into account how much damage the move actually does, or if it even does damage at all. For example, Sabrina here. Her Alakazam knows Psybeam, which would probably KO my Persian if it were to use it. However, Sabrina's AI will not prioritize it, because it's not super effective, so it only has around a 25% chance of using it. Alakazam is far more likely to either use Psy-Wave, a move so terrible it doesn't even exist anymore, Recover, even when they're at full health, or Reflect, even when Reflect is already up. Through a combination of these factors, for nearly all of the gym leaders, I swept through virtually their entire team simply by spamming one move with one Pokemon. And it's not like I'm overleveled for these fights, or even using especially powerful Pokemon on my team, aside from Exeggutor. You can see in the footage that, especially in the later parts of the game, I'm actually quite under-leveled, because the level curve is whack in Red and Blue. There were only 2 gym leaders that gave me a little more trouble than this, and in both cases, it was largely due to broken and dated battle mechanics that only existed in Gen 1. The first of these was Misty. She was the only gym leader that I actually lost to during my playthrough, but it wasn't because I didn't have any way of dealing with water types, it was mostly because her Starmie was landing critical hits nearly every turn, due to the busted way in which those odds were calculated in Gen 1. The exact math is a little more complicated, but the gist of it is that the faster a Pokemon is, the more likely it is to score critical hits, and Starmie is one of the fastest Pokemon in the game. The player can take advantage of this as well, but unless you massively overlevel, or exploit an oversight that allows you to skip Misty for the time being, there's no way to obtain a Pokemon with that kind of speed this early on. When I rematched Misty, I didn't have to change my strategy or think more about what I was doing. All I could really do was hope her Starmie didn't land as many critical hits this time, which thankfully it didn't. The other troublesome gym leader was Erica, though my issue there was far from unique to her. Virtually any trainers that use Grass-type Pokemon were annoying for the exact same reasons. A lot of Grass types learn Wrap, a move that was completely broken in Generation 1, because even though its base power was low, it effectively gives the user as many as 5 turns of uninterrupted damage, and could easily be spammed indefinitely if the Wrap user happened to be faster than the target. A lot of them also knew status moves, specifically Poison Powder, Sleep Powder, and Stun Spore. These were annoying, not only for their actual effects both in and out of battle, especially since Sleep can last up to 8 turns in this game, but also because the AI cheats. Whenever one of my Pokemon got statused, I would want to switch to one of my other Pokemon to avoid the annoying effects of the status condition. However, even though the AI is supposed to have a modifier that deprioritizes status moves when the player's Pokemon already has a status condition, if the player outspeeds or outprioritizes the AI trainer, which they always will when switching out, the AI doesn't actually select a move until after the player has already gone. As a result, they would often predict my switch and just status my next Pokemon as well. Lasses, female junior trainers, and beauties were all trainer classes I quickly grew to hate, because whenever I came across them, I knew they were probably going to have a bunch of Bellsprout that spammed Wrap, and Oddish that spammed the powder moves. Those 2 notes at the beginning of the overworld theme that plays whenever a female trainer sees you very quickly became a trigger sound for me. I think it's the... Fuck, I think this is the girl that has the stupid-ass grass types. God damn it. You are exactly who I was trying to avoid. I just hate hearing that trainer sees you theme because I know it's a Picnicker, and Picnickers have the most annoying Pokemon. They have the most annoying trainer sees you theme as well. Getting back to Erica, I didn't wind up losing to her, but she was the only gym leader besides Misty to score a KO on any of my Pokemon, so I guess that counts for something. There's only one other gym leader that I could see being a problem for anyone, and that's Brock, of all people. And once again, it has a lot more to do with what I would consider to be poor game design than it does to do with anything else. Brock may have been a total joke for me, but that was because I picked Squirtle. What about players who picked Charmander? Brock's Rock-type Pokemon resist Charmander's Fire-type moves. Brock's AI is terrible, so you could probably still win with enough trial and error, but it'd make for a very tedious battle, so ideally you would go and catch another Pokemon to help with this gym, but what exactly are you going to catch? Being frank, Kanto, from a gameplay perspective, has a pretty poor selection of wild Pokemon available to the player at the start of the game. Throughout the series, it's not unusual for most of the early game Pokemon to get outclassed as you progress further into the game, but in Red and Blue, none of them are even especially helpful in the early game. Virtually all of them only learn normal and flying type moves, which Brock's Pokemon also resist. And before you comment, well, what about Mankey? They learn Karate Chop, that's a fighting type move, right? Or what about the Nidos? They both learn Double Kick, don't they? Not in Red and Blue. So for every gym leader, it was a total binary. You either just happen to have a Pokemon that sweeps their entire team, or you basically can't win without heavily relying on luck. Nothing in between. Now, the mainline Pokemon games are never just a non-stop gauntlet of one battle after another. A large chunk of the experience is exploring the overworld, talking to NPCs, solving puzzles, and sometimes your progress will be impeded by story requirements rather than a specific battle you have to win. Usually something to do with the villains of the game, Team Rocket. Team Rocket are probably the most iconic villains in the Pokemon series. However, I don't think it's because of anything they actually say or do in these original games. When people think of Team Rocket, they don't think of, I don't know, the 4 Rocket brothers. They think of Jesse, James, and Meowth from the anime. Aside from kind of the Nugget Bridge guy, none of the interactions with any of its members are all that memorable or funny to me. Most of them just say something along the lines of, "Halt, intruder," when they see you, and "Oh no," when they lose. They don't have much of a defined goal or intention, they don't feel especially connected to anything else going on in the game. They're scarcely even mentioned by any characters outside of Team Rocket themselves, and their boss, Giovanni, never really stood out as an especially imposing or difficult foe. And this is generally how I feel about most of the characters in the Kanto region, to be honest. They're among the best known out of their series archetype, but it's not because their role in these games was anything special, it's simply because they were the first. They're the ones who always get brought back and referenced in later entries, and they're the ones who are most prominently featured in supplemental media, mainly the anime. There is one character who I think is an exception, but there'll be a better opportunity to discuss them later. Anyway, when it isn't a story requirement impeding your progress, it tends to be a natural obstacle, like a small tree or a boulder. Getting past those requires the use of hidden moves, or HMs. To me, HMs have always been an okay idea that were extremely poorly implemented. They used to be a series staple, but the game started to phase them out around the 3DS era, and eventually they just got rid of them completely, probably because of how universally despised they were by the player base. The idea was that earning certain gym badges would give your Pokemon the ability to use these HMs to clear obstacles in the overworld. The problem that most people had with them is that they took up one of your Pokemon's 4 move slots, and they could not be overwritten. Ever. Even the daycare technique didn't work in Generation 1. The idea behind making them impossible to get rid of was to try and prevent the player from soft-locking themselves, but it was kind of hard not to see them as a permanent blemish on one of your Pokemon, especially since the vast majority of hidden moves were completely useless in battle. Flash is a stat-lowering move, and not an especially useful one at that. Fly has a pretty mediocre base power, plus it's inaccurate and requires a turn of charge up. Strength is an objectively worse version of Body Slam. Cut is an objectively much worse version of Strength. Surf is the only one that's actually a desirable move for your Pokemon to know in battle. Now, at this point in time, I do think a lot of us, myself included, were exaggerating a little bit about just how awful these were. You could always catch Pokemon to be designated HM users, and even if you didn't want to do that, on a casual playthrough, how often are you actually going to need all 4 move slots on all 6 of your Pokemon? Even so, this is one aspect of the older games that I imagine most people do not miss. And I don't know what would have been wrong with just having this be something your Pokemon can do out of battle without it having to take up one of their 4 move slots in battle. And not to harp on about these for too long, but the several places where I had to use the same HM like 20 times in a row got on my nerves a little bit. I either have the HM or I don't. The amount of squares I have to move the boulder generally doesn't have any impact on the difficulty of the puzzle, it only affects how long it takes. As you get further into the game, it starts to get a lot more non-linear. It eventually gets to the point that being forced to complete objectives in a particular order becomes the exception, rather than the rule. And at the lack of a clear, linear path, the game largely stops giving the player any pointers. By now, I know the Kanto region like the back of my hand. I must have beaten Leaf Green about 20 times as a kid. But whenever I play through a game set in this region, I can't help but notice how much I'm going off memory compared to the other games in the series. In all of the Kanto games, there's a lot of stuff you just have to remember you're supposed to do. You have to remember where the entrance to Team Rocket's hideout is. You have to remember where to get a drink for the guard at Saffron City Gate. You have to remember where to find the house in the Safari Zone that gives you surf. You also have to remember to grab the gold teeth while you're there. They sneak a second required key item into the one dungeon. You have to remember where to find the key for Blaine's gym. By now, this stuff is all pretty much common knowledge in the Pokemon community, but I have to imagine that if I were playing this blind as a young kid, I would probably be very lost and confused. I suppose I can't necessarily call this a flaw. I have heard that back in the 90s, this is just how a lot of games were. You had to do a lot of your own exploring, talk to every NPC, read every sign, pick up every item, and do some of your own experimenting to see what they actually did. But I still have to call bullshit in a few places. During one of the encounters with Team Rocket, you infiltrate their hideout, where you're meant to solve a puzzle to figure out how to get the lift to take you down to the bottom floor so you can face Giovanni. Eventually, you encounter this one Rocket Grunt, who jeers that you need a key to make the lift move. So you defeat him, and afterwards, nothing happens. Now, I know that talking to him again afterwards is what causes him to drop the lift key and allow you to pick it up. But I can't imagine that somebody playing this game blind would. At every other point in the game where an NPC trainer says or does something important after you defeat them, including Giovanni later in this same dungeon, the dialogue triggers automatically, so why throw people for a loop with this one exception? I have to imagine that a lot of people playing this game just walked off without talking to him again, assuming that NPC had served his purpose after being interacted with once. It was also around this point that the game's limited bag space started to become an issue for me. On paper, I don't actually mind the concept of having limited bag space. It does make more logistical sense than the later games, where your backpack is a bottomless black hole. But one thing that kind of got on my nerves is that whenever I tried to pick up an item while the bag was full, the game never told me what the item on the ground actually was. For all I know, it could be some worthless junk, but there are a few scant items that I really want, and a couple of others that I actually need in order to finish the game, so I always had to go through the fuss of emptying out some space in my inventory and weighing up what was okay for me to discard, only for the item to usually wind up being some stupid shit like an X accuracy. It is also a bit annoying that throughout the game, a sizable chunk of your inventory space gets taken up by key items that you can't get rid of, even though many of them become pretty much useless at a certain point. After we're finished with Team Rocket Hideout, there is no reason to ever come back. We're never going to need the lift key again. All it does now is take up space. And ignoring everything else about the main adventure, the actual design of the overworld is very strange. The layouts of a lot of the routes and towns are completely nonsensical, and there are various points in the game where the intent was obviously to make a maze, but it just wound up being more of a mess. One of the biggest examples is Silphco. I actually quite like this part of the game otherwise. It's got a really cool and unique overworld theme, and it's basically the only time in this game where Team Rocket actually seems to have any impact on what's going on in the Kanto region, and therefore you feel a little more accomplished in defeating them. The layout of the dungeon, however, as it turns out, the complex maze of warp pads, which is intended to serve as the main gimmick for this location, is a mere distraction, because you barely have to use them in order to solve the puzzle. Just climb the stairs or take the elevator to the 5th floor, walk down this corridor, take this teleporter, immediately warp back to that same teleporter, continue walking down this corridor, and you've got the card key, which opens all these locked doors and pretty much lets you explore the building freely. If that one Rocket Grunt wasn't standing there, you wouldn't have to use the teleporters at all to get to this point. Same goes for the final gym in Viridian City. You've got this entire half of the building that serves no purpose. You've got these warp pads that you never actually have to use to solve the puzzle. You've got these 3 trainers blocking what is visibly a dead end. Like, what's going on there? Maybe the puzzle in this gym is messy on purpose, as a callback to those previous messy puzzles in the Team Rocket sections? It would be kinda fitting, since at the back of the gym, you find none other than Giovanni. Oh, so he was secretly one of the Kanto gym leaders this whole time. That's why he was always so easy to defeat. Before moving on to the final area of the game, I wanted to complete any and all optional side quests, which in Kanto meant going to catch the legendary birds. Throughout the series, catching legendary Pokemon is usually one of my least favorite parts of the game. They tend to have incredibly low catch rates, which is supposed to make them difficult. However, they have the same random AI as any other wild Pokemon, and even if you battle them as early as you possibly can, they're still usually at a pretty manageable level. Surviving their attacks and whittling them down to a small amount of health is quite trivial most of the time. But then you'll just be stuck there throwing balls at them for ages, because even when they're as weakened as possible and you're using the best possible Pokeball, each one only has a 2 or 3% chance of catching them. It often winds up taking a really long time, just for the sake of taking a really long time. I stock up on a shit ton of Pokeballs and hunker down, fully expecting to spend at least an hour on this. I go after Articuno first, which is on the Seafoam Islands. While I can never figure out how to navigate this place from one side to the other, getting to Articuno from the Cinnabar Island side, I actually had a surprisingly easy time with. Once I find Articuno, I save in front of them and begin the battle. After paralyzing them and whittling away most of their health, I find that my Lapras pretty much walls all of its attacks. The first 4 Ultra Balls I throw all miss. Yeah, in Generation 1, Pokeballs could miss. It doesn't actually mean anything different from the Pokemon simply busting out of a Pokeball, but it certainly feels annoying. On the 5th Ultra Ball, I finally hit it, and I catch it. Well, okay. I wasn't expecting that to happen so quickly, but I'll take it. Next, I go after Zapdos, who's found in an abandoned power plant near the north entrance of Rock Tunnel. After getting to Zapdos in the back, I take out most of its health, put it to sleep and whittle down its health a little more, and begin chucking balls. It's gonna take an hour after how fast Articuno was. Oh my god, these are going so quick. And Moltres went the exact same way when I reached them on Victory Road. So now, I was a little bit confused. Was I just getting really lucky, or was there something mechanically different about catching wild Pokemon in Gen 1 that I was unaware of? I did a little research and found out that it was very much the latter. As it turns out, inflicting wild Pokemon with status conditions helps a lot more in Generation 1 than it does in the later games, with Sleep causing even legendary Pokemon to have catch rates as high as 25%, which, you know what, is absolutely fine by me. If you've shown that fighting them is trivial to you, catching them should be very much the same. Now, I haven't been super positive about Gen 1 or its mechanics throughout most of this video, but this is one aspect of these original games where I'll gladly say, more of this, please. After the player has collected all 8 gym badges, the guards let them traverse Route 23 in order to access Victory Road, and eventually the Pokemon League. This is the only place in the game that I would say has some battles that are a little bit more difficult for reasons that aren't bullshit. When I say that, I'm mainly talking about the 1st and 4th members of the Elite Four, Lorelei and Lance, as well as the champion. They still aren't hard, per se. Their movesets are still awful, and their AI is still bugged to the point where Lorelei can actually soft-lock your game, but you are unlikely to be able to sweep through them by mindlessly spamming one move with one of your Pokemon, which I know is a very low bar to clear, but they are among the few boss trainers in the game that clear it. And for what it's worth, Lance actually managed to be a little troublesome for me, due to his Dragonair crit Hyper Beaming my best Pokemon for his team right off the bat. The middle 2 members of the Elite Four, Bruno and Agatha, are both rather infamous, but for very different reasons. Bruno, in Red and Blue especially, is far and away the weakest member of the Elite Four throughout the entire series. He specializes in fighting types, which are way down there with bug and fire types for being among the most underpowered Pokemon in Gen 1. They get no especially useful moves or type advantages, and their special is so low that if you so much as breathe on them with any move of a special type, let alone a super effective one, his Pokemon all just crumple like paper. As for Agatha, she's known as the Agatha Lottery for good reason. Her AI is completely random, her Pokemon all know moves that can cause status conditions with massive RNG factors, namely confusion, sleep, and paralysis, and she's also among the few trainers in Gen 1 who can sometimes switch out their Pokemon, which also happens at complete random. She can be as easy as Bruno, or she can be one of the most annoying fights in the game. It depends entirely on luck. Once you're through the Elite Four, you can finally take on the champion, who turns out to be none other than the rival, Blue. Now Blue, I actually quite like as a rival. Even only counting his portrayal in the games, ignoring how he's been portrayed in supplemental material, like the anime or whatever, he's one of the few human characters in Gen 1 who genuinely holds up as one of my favorites of their series archetype. He stands out among the other rival characters for being pretty much the only one to take a more antagonistic role. Even other jerk rivals, like Silver from the Johto games, were usually at least tangentially on the same side as the player when it came to the game's conflict. When Blue sees that Team Rocket is attacking, he has no interest in helping to stop them, but hangs around anyway because he assumes that we, the player, will turn up to save the day, and he wants to have a battle with us when we do. Combine that, his arrogant attitude, and the fact that his battles are probably among the most consistently challenging in the game, if only because he actually uses a varied team, and he probably makes for a better main villain than the actual main villain does. As a champion, I'm a little more mixed on him. On one hand, the whole exchange here really works from a character perspective. Even though you've beaten him several times before now, he always had the excuse that he wasn't really trying that hard against you because he doesn't really take you that seriously as a rival. However, now that you've beaten him in a battle that had actual stakes to it, he no longer has that excuse, and basically has a whole third act breakdown as a result. It's great. On the other hand, I do find it a little underwhelming that the final battle that the whole game has been building up to is just a slightly stronger version of the same team that you've already fought many times throughout the game, which consists mostly of relatively common Pokemon you'll already have encountered and beaten plenty of up till this point. I mean, the only Pokemon you might be seeing for the first time in this battle is Exeggutor, which he didn't even have for me. I definitely think we should have had a final battle with Blue around this point in the game, but I might have preferred the champion be someone else. I actually want to give a full play-by-play of my battle with him though, because it was interesting. He leads with Pidgeot, who Lapras easily defeats. He sends out Alakazam next, who is considerably more threatening than Sabrina's Alakazam, since it knows 2 damaging Psychic-type moves, and therefore is twice as likely to actually use one. I decide to switch into Exeggutor since they pretty much wall all of Alakazam's attacks, and because I had taught this move and really wanted to use it at some point before the game was over, use Explosion to get Alakazam off the field as quickly as possible. However, immediately afterwards, I question if that was a good idea, because Exeggutor was probably my best counter to the rival's Venusaur. He sends in Rhydon next, who my Blastoise easily OHKOs. Next up is Gyarados. I want to switch to Raichu, but I'm worried I'll just switch into a Hyper Beam, so I try taking it on with Blastoise, but quickly realize that this simply is not going to be a viable option. So I risk the switch, and exactly what I didn't want to happen, happens. Gyarados nearly OHKOs Lapras with Hyper Beam as well, and Lapras doesn't do nearly as much damage as I would like with Ice Beam, but thankfully they manage to hit with Sing while Gyarados is recharging. I can then safely switch into Persian, who then whittles away the rest of Gyarados' health. The rival sends out Arcanine, who finishes off Persian, and then gets KO'd itself by my Sandslash, leaving Venusaur as Blue's last Pokemon. Unfortunately, it has a type advantage against all 3 of the Pokemon I have left. Sandslash tanks a Mega Drain and gets in a little damage with Earthquake, but just can't keep up with Venusaur's output. Lapras has so little health left that they don't even get a chance to attack. It all comes down to Blastoise, who's also pre-damaged from earlier in the battle. They manage to tank a Mega Drain, but they simply will not be able to outdamage Venusaur. This is looking really grim. Unless this freezes, I lose. Are you serious? Cause yeah, you don't unthaw in Gen 1.
That was like an anime thing. Just barely hanging on and then the freeze. That was actually a really good battle.
That has to be one of the craziest champion battles I've ever had in Pokemon. It genuinely felt plucked straight from the anime. Not only with how close it was, but the fact that it even came down to a starter versus starter rematch, especially since I actually lost that first starter v starter battle at the beginning of the game. Our team is entered in the Hall of Fame, and the main adventure of Pokemon Blue is complete. Assuming I actually make a video like this for the other Pokemon games, this is the part where I would normally say that, even though the credits are rolling, the journey is far from over. However, in Pokemon Red and Blue, it kind of is over after the credits roll. There aren't really any new areas unlocked by defeating the champion, you can't rematch trainers, I suppose you could catch more Pokemon for your Pokedex, but it's impossible to complete in single player. It does seem that, at one point, there was planned to be a fight against Professor Oak in the post-game. He has a battle sprite and a fully programmed team, consisting of a Tauros, the grass, fire, and water types that can potentially be used by the rival, and a Kanto starter, presumably the one that neither you nor the rival chose, which for me would have been Charizard. But there is no way to access this without using cheats or a glitch, and even if it were in the game proper, that would still just be one more battle. It seems that in Generation 1, a lot of what would become the usual post-game loop in many of the later entries was instead restricted to an entirely separate game. In the base Red and Blue, all the player can really do now is fight the Elite Four over and over, plus one other thing. Way back in Cerulean City, you may have noticed this cave. Up till now, the entrance was blocked by a cool trainer, but now that we've entered the Hall of Fame, he's no longer there. This is Cerulean Cave, otherwise known as the Unknown Dungeon. It's a very long and windy, but fairly linear path, where some of the highest leveled wild encounters in any game can be found, at the end of which you will find Mewtwo. Now, obviously, I'm just going to catch it with the Master Ball that I got way back in Silphco. That's what I was saving it for. But before I do, I want to see if my team can beat it. I lead with Raichu, who immediately gets OHKO'd by Swift. I don't even think the crit mattered. I use Persian next, who manages to get a Toxic off before also getting OHKO'd by Psychic. That crit definitely didn't matter. I use Lapras next, and they actually last quite a long time, primarily because Mewtwo keeps using its turns to recover off the Toxic damage, but when it finally attacks, Gladys also gets OHKO'd. That crit probably mattered though. Finally, I use Exeggutor, who becomes the first member of my team to actually survive an attack from Mewtwo, and they finish off the legendary Psychic type with Explosion. We'd won, with 2 Pokemon to spare. And then I just reset and threw the Master Ball. I'm obviously not intending on using Mewtwo for anything, but I still felt I should catch it for the sake of completionism. Afterwards, the very last thing I did was head back to the daycare. You may have noticed me placing a Caterpie in there earlier, because I wanted to see how much it would grow if I just left it there for the entire game. It ended up growing by 22 levels, which was a little underwhelming, but Red and Blue weren't exactly very long games. And that's Pokemon Red and Blue. Quite far from my favorite games in the Pokemon series. In fact, it may sound harsh, but I think if I ever get to a full ranking, they'll be quite close to my least favorite. They're not outright terrible games, the series obviously had to start somewhere, but so much of what I enjoy about the series just isn't there yet. The creature design obviously needed some refining, the move pools are way too shallow, the balancing is awful, the boss fights outside of debatably some members of the Elite Four are way too easy. The only remotely troublesome ones were only that way because of buggy mechanics that were exclusive to Gen 1. And quite frankly, unless you're doing personal homework like I am, I just don't see any reason to go back to these original games when the rest of the series exists. For almost everything I did praise in these original games, there are other games in the series that provide the exact same thing, except without all of the caveats that come from Gen 1. If you want to play through the Kanto region, you have a set of far superior remakes in Fire Red and Leaf Green. If you want to play through a game with the classic Game Boy graphics and sound font, you have a set of far superior sequels in Gold, Silver, and Crystal. The only reason I can think why anyone would possibly want to play Red and Blue versus any other game in the series would be to mess around with some of the game-breaking glitches, which was actually one of the first things I did when starting up the game. In a video I saw like 12 years ago, I found that if you manipulate where this girl walks by standing where you don't want her to go until she's standing in this patch of grass, and then activate the cutscene where Oak has you follow him to his lab, the girl actually interferes with the player's scripted movement, causing them to walk through the building and eventually get stuck in a wall, where they will be soft-locked. Completely pointless, but mildly amusing. However, I don't think it's much of an endorsement to say that one of the best things about a game are the ways you can break it. Now, while I don't feel that I've been unfair with my criticisms, I do have to concede I wasn't there. I didn't exist yet at the time these games were what Pokémon was, and there were no later entries to compare them to. I might have experienced them differently if I'd played them when they were new, and experienced the series' original explosion onto the scene. But as someone whose first game was Pokémon Diamond, and never went back any further than Gen 3 until I was already an adult, I'm not capable of seeing the original games from that perspective, and I think it would be unreasonable to expect me to. I can appreciate their existence because the rest of the series wouldn't exist without them, but I think that's a completely separate argument from saying one is better than, or even comparable in quality to the other. Like, you know, most modern cars aren't nearly as influential or historically important as the Ford T-Series, but which one would you rather have to drive? While, as of writing and recording this, I haven't yet revisited the later generations, I strongly predict that I'm going to have a far better time with most of those. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Before that, though, there is one more game in Generation 1.